Hey everyone, welcome back to another session here with Toby and Ray. I'm JC, I'm a product designer and developer, and today I'm really excited about this session because we are going to be learning, well, what's behind all this we've been talking about in the latest episodes around the ChatGPT apps and MCP apps. So really excited for this one. And before we get into it, I will pass on the mic.
Hey, I'm Toby. I'm curious to see what we come up with today. But yeah, so again, we're learning about MCP and MCP app things. And I think today we're going to start getting into a bit more of some of the details.
Hi, I'm Ray Deck. I'm a founder over at State Change AI, where we work on all sorts of, challenging, issues in both building for and building with AI. And so I've been really excited to be part of this investigation into MCP apps and to talk a little bit more about that today.
Awesome. So I think today what I want to understand is a bit more, again, behind the curtains. So let's start by covering the basics. When we talk about MCP apps, there's, the MCP part in it. So I wanted to start by understanding a bit more about what MCP really is.
So the Model Context Protocol was, initially introduced to the world in the end of 2024. Is about helping AI be able to with various resources that might be on the web or just sort of generally outside of the model. Models are pretty smart, right? Like our friends at Anthropic and OpenAI and Google have spent billions of dollars, training models that have, at this point over 1 trillion parameters to try to make them smart off the bat. But there are all sorts of issues relate to hallucinations because they only know so much. And I recently read a book that I thought described it really well. It said that AI are bullshitters. They are trying to give you the next word that's going to make you happy. But they only know what they know, and they will try to use whatever they have to be able to give that to you. So the question is, how can we give better answers in terms of its text generation, but even more than that, give it the opportunity to do things in the world that actually make it a whole lot more useful and can make you even happier. I call this giving AI eyes and hands. Eyes to be able to ingest information, and hands in order to be able to have an impact on the world. But in order to do this, AI needs to have access to stuff that exists in the world and needs to know how to use it. The idea behind Model Context Protocol is an effort by originally from Anthropic to create a standard for how AI can go and talk to the world in order to both be able to gather information so it can be more truthful and to be able to have impact on the world. And really, this kind of gets done through like basically giving it functions it can call, right? And in AI, we call this tool use. But now instead of having every server have their own way of doing a tool and having to learn the protocol that goes with the way that OpenAI does it versus the way Anthropic does it versus the way Google does it versus the way Kimi does it or DeepSeek or whoever, there can be a standardized protocol that describes here's what a tool is and here's how you can bring it into the context of your model. Anthropic, because they're big into tool use from relatively early on, came into this and wanted to create more of a standard, even as ChatGPT and OpenAI were kind of, running in their own way in terms of having something a little more proprietary. But it really caught on. So initially it comes out in November 24. This is when I first hear about it, is when this first announcement is, and it's really slick. So the idea is, and this is like back when they had Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which when you think about, now we're at, 4.5 and 4.6 is like how quickly this stuff has been changing just in the course of the last, 15 months. And being able to take these models and more context through just having the standard. And if you're an early adopter of Model Context Protocol, you're probably doing it through like Claude Desktop. And then fairly shortly afterwards, they talk about Block here. Block had an agent that's called Goose that is also a desktop side agent, a desktop side AI client that was an early adopter of Model Context Protocol and still continues to be the place where you can sort of try some of the more leading edge features of MCP. But the key to MCP is that it's about packaging. is about packaging together both here's what you can do in the world or how you get information of the world, but how to do it. Sometimes the question comes up like, why wouldn't you just use normal APIs to go talk to it? And the problem is the normal APIs might have all of the functionality that one at a certain level needs, but they don't really describe how to do it. And MCP's strongest bits are going to be where it's packaging those two things together. And and if you sort of get into Model Context Protocol IO, this is like the site where they really talk about how the whole architecture works. They talk about how you can connect to all these different things, but they talk about it in relatively high level terms. And I think it can be really useful to think about this, not in terms of what does the market say, but by looking under the covers. Just like it can be really helpful to understand how the web works by, looking at dev tools and looking at like what the HTML actually has to say. Similarly, we can look at these model context protocol servers through inspectors. Now, this is one of my favorite inspectors to use. It's called MCP Jam. There's some others. There was like one that came out from the Model Context Protocol project in Anthropic that's just available you can run from the command line. And Postman also has some good stuff on this, but MCP Jam is like really, really friendly. It's an easy download, easy to recommend. And you can take a server, like here's the Notion MCP server, which is a relatively popular MCP server, allows you to connect your AI with your Notion. And the thing that like MCP Jam will allow us to do is a couple things. So one is I can look under the covers at like what are the tools that MCP server exposes. I find to understand MCP and like why it creates value, it's a lot easier to look at it than to be throwing a lot more words at. Like there's a whole extended article over here on the model protocol.io site, and they do a decent job walking through it. But I think that the way it works explains a lot more like why it would be valuable to the AI, because it's really about packaging together the functionality, like the tools, like how you can have an impact in the world, with instructions on how to use it. Because what AI really wants is instructions, and it wants content to understand how things fit together. And that becomes a big difference between this and having just a API that someone might access. There are other things you can do to make the AI to make the function calls in the model context protocol even easier to work with AI. But I think the biggest is that idea of packaging those things together. So it's kind of like using dev tools, in your browser, where you're able to see under the covers of like how it's thinking, like these are the screws of the the browser, and this is what it's thinking about, and like what transactions it's making. That's the kind of value that we get from using an inspector on one of the MCP servers. Allows us to look a little bit under the covers as to it works. And to do that, let's take one that's actually relatively popular, which is the MCP server. And that allows you to connect your AI to Notion for like your database work and what have you. And to do that, you can there are a few different kinds of facilities that these MCP servers expose. Some of the most popular ones are tools, resources, prompts, and tasks. Now, I'll tell you that there are more types of things MCP can do than most people use it for. But by far the most popular use of it is to provide what are called tools, which are basically functions, or if you will, API calls, that the AI can do in order to, bring more information in or express intent out. So let's take a look at how we do that with
Sorry.
Notion. By far the most popular way to work with MCP is going to be tools, because tools have been available initial November release, and some of this other stuff came along a bit later and hasn't got quite the level of adoption yet. So if I click on tools, we can see all the different tools that are exposed by Notion, and you can see that there are maybe a dozen of them, and some of them you see have both like you can create a comment on like one of these documents. You can indicate what the parent is that you want to add to, and like what then the text, which is going to be through Notion's own structures of how you do this stuff. But you'll notice here has these little instructions. These instructions aren't like some sort of oh by the way. These are central to why model context protocol can be valuable. because they focus our attention on they focus AI's attention rather on how these apps are to be used, or these tools are to be used, and like what the shape should look like. So this must be a page, okay? And this represents this is an array of text objects. So it's giving it the hint, not in the form of like a shape or some sort of validator, right? Type validator, but also just in plain language. This is the way you would tell somebody how to use this. And those descriptions don't need to be super terse. Like, let's take a look at Notions up here. Look at how much text to it. See, perform a search over blah blah blah. This is all examples that's giving of how you would use this. And those examples then are being injected right into the context of the AI, so that not only does it know that a search tool is available, but here's how to use it, and here's what a good search looks like. And then here's what a good string looks like, and gives more information about that. Here's what the URL looks like, etc. Like where things could be optional or not. So so this is like more what a TypeScript oriented SDK would do. A TypeScript oriented SDK, giving me types, so I can't like put the wrong type, can't put a string where a number is supposed to go. Right? It goes another level up. It's describing what good looks like through having this additional text that the AI is reading and figuring out how to use this. Like the instructions come with the tool calls. And that's a key distinction between the way that like normal APIs work, because normal APIs just sort of have here's your API, versus the the way MCP works. Now, you've been on like documentation, like README documentations, etc., that like describe how to use these APIs. And really, you can think of MCP as packaging of those instructions, right? Those how-tos with the actual functionality you're trying to do, and two things together. Then we have the additional consideration that it is something more like a person, because it speaks in natural language, than like a traditional machine, which thinks in terms of structured data, that's going to be wanting to use this on one side or the other. It's like by orienting it more to like the way the AI is going to profit from it, which is through get text in context wise, and being able to use it in a way that allows it to work with natural language, it gets much happier. This is one of the reasons why search engines, like the search you see here for Notion, are great, first passes at how you can get more value from MCPs. These know how to create, the AIs rather, know how to create those first pass here. They know how to make a query. They know how to make a search query. They've seen search queries a whole bunch of times. It's just a matter of describing what you're looking for, and then that's what these are able to take in. And then where things get more complicated is when you're trying to express what you're trying to do. So this is like going back to your framework, JC, about like insight. Insight is often about pulling information in, which is something that like AI knows how to ask questions, gets answers from the tool. And then the create and explore, that's going to be where things are more challenging.
So, Ray, I think this is a great overview on MCPs and how they basically offer us a much more extended way to talk to different products and a next step to APIs. So I'm curious to know, is there any risk or downside to basically using an MCP rather than our traditional APIs?
Well, the downside is the MCPs are exposing those APIs to the AI, right? So the downside from a security point of view is going to be that if you give AI access to the tools that matter to you, well, then AI can start to do things on your behalf, is able to learn things on your behalf. We need to remember that these AIs, most of them at least, are run by third-party companies, and that means if I do a search from Notion, I'm the data that comes back from Notion is being fed right back into OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, or whatever. We're sending them our data, right? Which is just like what would happen if you were typing things into the AI that you're talking to, but is definitely something that's happening from the MCP as well. So like the big profit opportunity is you're getting data from these systems, right? but the big risk is exactly the same, right? The strength and the shadow come from the same place. So that becomes like the downside of it. There's not really a downside security point of view of this versus going and using just using an API. But there is a question like, how is it going to go get to the API, right? So like in and usually the way we see it use an API is going to be through another tool call, right? So if you're using like a Claude Code or like one of the sort of the new generation of agentic builders, they're actually built with the idea of having like 6 tools that they use. Like read file, write file, list directory, grep, and usually bash, which allows them to execute anything on the local machine. And then because they're doing that, they go bash to curl to going just running things from any given API. And that's like the foundation for some of the cooler things we've been hearing about more lately, like OpenClaw and what have you. Like that's where you can really get in some superpowers without having to bring any of these MCPs to the party. That this sort of gets to a little bit more advanced use case, but that can sort of get you to the same place. So when you're thinking about APIs versus MCP, it's like there's a gateway to the other rather than introducing additional that many additional risks. Now, there are costs to introducing more tools to your AI. Like every one of these tools that you see here, like the search with all this description and like all these things about how to use it, this has to get injected into your system prompt. And that means it's using it in context. And any of these models can only have a limited amount of context in the conversation before it finally says, hey, I have to cry uncle because I've run out of input tokens I'm allowed to use. In the case of our friends at like OpenAI, that's like 400,000. In the case of Anthropic, it's like 200,000. And in the case of Google, it's like 1 million. And a token is roughly 3/4 of a word, right? So in the case of Anthropic, which is the smallest of them, like the 2,000 tokens, we're talking about maybe 60,000 words that's able to. Well, for any given tool, that's relatively straightforward. But if you have like a dozen, hundreds of tools in there, that can actually get very, very expensive. Which is the reason why there's neat technology for like trying to abstract away all of that context that might otherwise get loaded in your tool pattern. But that becomes the kind of thing but those the big things I'd be concerned about when like thinking MCs or anything else to your AI are going to be, one, crowding context, right? Because you have too much stuff in there and like it using up space could otherwise be used for stuff that really matters to you, right? Your data, your concerns, what have you. So that crowding is a consideration. And the second consideration is one of security of like, hey, have AI run around and start doing things with these tools you just give it access to, right? It's like if you hire someone and you give them all the keys to all the important parts of your business, you trust them, right? But they do have the power to go do things you might not want them to, and then that becomes a source of risk. So that becomes like those are the two top line considerations I would have for bringing MCPs or other capabilities into your AI.
Really interesting. I think we will see how different companies and developers work around these risks and downsides, so to speak. And it just brought to my mind a company that we met in Paris, and they were working on a solution for the risk that you mentioned around having AI just fetch any data and without you knowing what it is doing and how it is doing it. So I think we are starting to see already like some patterns emerging on people trying to find solutions to these things. So that is really, really interesting.
Cool. Yeah, and like this is an ongoing problem. It has actually less to do with MCP per se, and more to do with the AI. And the question is how much access you give to each. And there's some work of trying to make us smarter about the way MCP thinks as well. Now, tools are the most common use, but I also want to bring your attention to the idea of resources. For example, Notion uses a resource, which is not so much a So a resource isn't a tool that allows you to do something. A resource is just text, right? So in this case, it's text about like how Notion Markdown works. And the idea is it allows it to train the AI on how best to send into Notion that Notion will then be able to use to turn into proper Notion pages. And so that's how you can get more text in, but that only gets loaded in the event that the AI says, I want to get that text. Right. So it's like, there's a parallel thing that's called skills now that is popular among AI agents, where it's like where we have this idea of progressive disclosure, where based on a need for something, I then can load in more of that text, which then goes into my AI. So it's able to be smarter about that and sort of have a, like Matrix like no kung fu moment, and be able to, make better decisions so that it can create this markdown and then go back into the tools and do things like create a page or something, right, or update a page, etc. That's going to be smart, right, about how in terms of getting quality content into Notion. So those tools and resources are kind of like the parallels of getting context, right, getting information in eyes, and then being able to express intent out, and that allows me through a Google through a chat in ChatGPT or Claude or any of these other tools to be able to then integrate with Notion. I can be asking, hey, what do I have in Notion that's about X, and let's update it. Let's make a document that's about Y, and it can just those things, right? And we often experience those as connectors and apps in Claude and in ChatGPT. But then another level that comes up. And like, think about like 8 months ago or so, there was a couple folks who were at the time over at Shopify brought up this MCP UI specification. And MCP UI was an idea of you have an MCP server, chat interface, but so far, all of the conversation had been between the AI, which is in the text, and the tools, which are, of course, somewhere else, right? So it's all text to text going back and forth. So MCP UI introduced this idea of we're not going to have UI widgets, right, that are able to, and sort of, I think we've seen some of these examples before of we have these widgets that will interact with us and interact with I'm not sure that they don't have a picture here, but the that we can then with without being inside the text. So all the tools I've been showing so far are about how the AI, right, like how ChatGPT as an AI is going to go talk to Notion, get text back, be able to make better decisions, be able to send information back to Notion, etc. Where things get, that sort of is leaving the user out of the mix a little bit, right? The user is able to express their intent in the AI, but their relationship with the actual tooling and relationship with the resources, right there behind the MCP, are a bit more abstracted away. So MCP UI, is a solution to that, to connect to just connect the that relationship between the AI and the third-party service back to the human being. And it shouldn't surprise us that Shopify was excited about this, because Shopify says this looks like something we can, that allows people to have more of an experience, allows them to do commerce, right, through these chat experiences as well. I can go search for something, I find it, I want to have a buy button, and that buy button becomes something that can be displayed. So we can, again, bring that back to here and like talk about some other some servers that work on just that. So we talk about Notion MCP, which doesn't have a UI element to it because it's sort of text to text. But then there's another one that came out kind of recently. It's very cool by Excalidraw. And Excalidraw is a service that allows you. It's a whiteboarding, online whiteboarding service. In fact, it's a free online whiteboarding project that is easy to recommend. But they made an MCP server, an official one. And if we take a look at the tools in that MCP server, I can switch from Notion to looking at Excalidraw by just clicking on Excalidraw up here. It has, I can create, this view of Excalidraw, and and it will then send into that view because it can just sort of express intent, right? Like say, hey, I want to, draw a diagram. The diagrams can contain these bits, and then also contains a tool, right, to tell, which they just call README. In fact, if I were to run that tool, it's kind of like the resource we looked at before. It just gives information on how you can use Excalidraw well. So that's that the AI, when it's told that it wants to make a diagram, is going to read the README, find out how to use Draw, and then draw Excalidraw for you to explain what's going on. So just to give that a quick test. This is everything that's great about MCP Jam. It has support for these for like a built-in chat that's nice and simple. Like you can go pay for the Excalidraw for MCP Jam stuff, but like they provide free access to Haiku, which is the smallest of the models. And if I were just to say, explain how model context protocols, it just acts like a chat, and it will just sort of give me some description and big old wall of text, right? Okay, there's a lot going on in here. Text. Okay, like that's too much text. Make me a diagram, right? And then it goes to Excalidraw, does that README thing before, then it creates this view and creates an Excalidraw environment to describe it. And if you ask if it describes something much more complicated, it will make a pretty complicated too.
This is really cool.
So the idea is this is something that is just sitting in the flow, right, of your experience with your chat. And you can also see how like the model for how we now think about apps gets very different. Now, instead of I have an app and you're going to be in my app and maybe I bring some AI into my app, the model gets flipped, right? Because now I have this experience where I ask about whatever I want to ask about. Excalidraw had no idea what I want to know about, but its job is to help me do that better through describing, this, through being able to draw this out for me. Or maybe I want to do this with, with Notion or something, right? Where I want to pull information from Notion using the other MCP server we just talked about, and then I want to get that described back to me visually using Excalidraw, or using a video using the MCP explainer, right? That I sort of worked on over the weekend, or using something else, right? Either to explain things to me, to connect it to another source of information, to be able to make better decisions. And the apps that we've been looking at together in our series, right, where we have seen like the ability to select a product and then go shop for that product, or be able to buy it, or be able to make a decision or make a reservation or do a thing. That's how we sort of bring all this stuff back together.
I think for me that's one of the most important things about all this, is where you start to bring, you kind of get, it's like the 2 + 2 = 5 kind of thing, whereby by bringing these things that do things really well, like Excalidraw brings extra value to that context of how MCP works, and by adding these things on top of each other, you can get to exactly what you want to solve, potentially using the best tools to do that without having to involve lots of things. It's kind of, as a great example, it's like we're kind of inverting things now, rather than where we used to think about bringing AI into apps. We're kind of bringing apps into AI and deconstructing them, and then AI is deciding where it wants to deal with the data. And I think, well, what we're going to see from my perspective is going to be a lot more of this. This is where a lot more of the value comes from. You unlock the value by bringing really good functionality and drive it into your AI conversations to kind of be exactly whatever flow you want to do. So I think Excalidraw is a really good example. There's tons of things. Interestingly, actually, one of the things I'd like to see actually is what would happen if you asked different models to do that same diagram, because Haiku's a pretty simple model, isn't great, and you put a more advanced model onto that, and I think you'll get a much better diagram, which is thinking more about what you need and the best way of representing it, just from the same README file. So I think that the power of the model is going to become more important as we try and do more of this. So it's doing smarter thinking around that sort of gluing of things together.
Yeah, And like how do you profit from that as all these things keep on getting better? You have better resources, better inputs, better things where you can be having an impact on the world. And how do human beings come into the middle of this, right? Like a lot of when the first part of the MCP story I was talking about was all about AI getting talked directly to these services, right? Cut person out of the middle, right? You don't have to use the app anymore now. Essentially, instead of you being a user of Node, it's the AI getting to be the user of Notion. And there's a lot of value to be had in that. But then but I link back to your intent and what you want to have happen in the world. And I think the promise of MCP apps, previously MCP UI, is that we can now remake that connection. There's a little bit of a debate, like in the agentic building community, about the utility of MCP versus just using CLIs, right? Like command line tools, because agents are so good at just running command line scripts now. This is because of Bash as a super tool that I was talking about before, I think. But what all of those things are is by way of human out of the loop. There's a lot of value, a lot of productivity to be had by cutting the human out of the loop when the human is not necessary. But if we can, but that actually puts even more of a focus on how we can get more value from each second that the human is going to be involved. How can we get more value from your ideas, more value from your intent, more value from your expression of business logic? And and that's where I think MCP becomes much more interesting, because previously you might have been, oh, this is kind of a lot of craft and overhead just to be able to get AI to services if the CLIs can maybe do a better job, especially for agentic. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like if you're going to be using something like a Claude Code, Codex, or OpenClaw, or one of these tools, it probably stands to reason not looking to use MCP. You want to use something simpler. And that's great, and that can work. So I think MCP is becoming truly relevant in 2026 because of MCP apps and the MCP UI that first came out 8 months ago, and that's being much more popularized because ChatGPT started supporting it last month, and our friends at Anthropic started supporting it this month, and I'm expecting Google to come around relatively soon too, as a way to bring the most important part of people back into the mix. And I think that the people who are working on apps that ask, how can I bring that most important part of that human intent back, are going to be the ones that create the most value and are going to make the most money in the space.
I mean, it was interesting. I think you touched on this a bit, right? That there's a time when people like the whole context stuffing of having to put all the descriptions into the context. And there was a lot of people, I mean, GitHub, I think we sort of talked to them recently, they used to have 110 tools. And as soon as you put that in, your context is just, you've lost half of it. So they had to focus on bringing it down. And I think that sort of impact meant that a lot of people were looking for different options. And then Cloudflare had a paper about using code tools where it would, the LM just built API interfaces to do whatever task was needed. But I think what you're saying is absolutely right, in that this kind of connection with people it feels like the MCP standard is becoming that sort of unifying thing at the moment. I mean, obviously it can change, but of all the different tools, although it has drawbacks to it, it's not perfect in terms of some of the implementations now. It looks like it's the thing that a lot of people are standardizing, and we're seeing that explosion of MCPs being developed, and particularly OpenAI with this sort of MCP App Marketplace. If this feels like at the moment that MCP is going to be a very important standard for everyone to support, for doing both of the agentic things, but also to allow bringing the human and bringing those both pieces to be in place.
It's very interesting, and I wonder where this all will be in 2, 3 years, 10 years, whether all products will evolve into being just MCP apps, or if there might be like a future where a good UX or a good experience on a product actually becomes the opposite of an MCP app, where you actually enter purposely a world like we have today, different apps or websites where you enter that specific world, and then you let users explore that world in different ways, the same way we are doing today with apps. Maybe it becomes like a different way to market your product. So I wonder what that'll do to the market of apps and products in general. So that was a great session. I think we all learned quite a lot. Thank you again, Ray. Thank you, Toby, and see you in the next one.